You're in Rome, January 897. It's the kind of winter day where the sun never really shows its face. The streets are muddy, the air is sharp but wet, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. And you're not alone. The roads are filling, bakers are closing their shops early. You see monks in coarse wool robes, merchants with their rough hands. Everyone is walking the same direction. People are passing ancient stone walls, still scarred from old sieges. A dog darts between your legs. The smell of wood, smoke hangs in the air, and all of it, every step, every quiet glance, leads towards the same place. The Lateran Basilica. Usually, this is a place of celebration. Coronations, mass, the scent of incense and fresh flowers. But not today. Inside, it's dim. Candles flicker against high arches, the air is heavy with incense and something else, a cold, sour smell beneath the perfume. All eyes face the front, and that's when you see it. Where the Pope should be sitting is a corpse. Not a metaphor, an actual corpse. Propped up in a chair, wearing white papal robes, a tall tiara rests crookedly on his decaying head. The trial is about to begin. This is the Cadaver Synod, one of the strangest moments in church history. A pope on trial months after his death. And it sounds like a plot of a dark political satire, something that Jean-Paul Sartre would write. But this wasn't. And it wasn't medieval theater for theater's sake. This was about power, revenge, and a theological question that the church had been wrestling with for centuries. A question so important that when the trial ended and the pope who ordered it was murdered, the answer would shape Christian life for over 1,000 years. To understand why a dead pope ended up in court, we have to go back. Not just a few years, but hundreds. The early church had faced persecution that was brutal and relentless. Christians were dragged from their homes, beaten, imprisoned, executed. But not all stood firm. Some priests and bishops, they handed over sacred scrolls to be burned. Some offered incense to Roman gods in exchange for their lives. Some betrayed the name of fellow believers. And when the persecution ended, these same clergy wanted to return to ministry. But there was a problem. If a priest had denied Christ, could his baptism still be considered valid? If a bishop had been a coward under pressure, was the Eucharist he served still truly the body and blood of Christ? It became one of the greatest controversies of the early church, the Donatist controversy. And the Donatists argued the purity of the church depends on the purity of its leaders. If a minister is corrupt, their ministry is null and void. They must be replaced and their sacraments done over. But Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, disagreed. So imagine this is sort of like a courtroom. The Donatists on one side holding up a priest's betrayal as if it's evidence in their trial. The Donatist prosecutor, Your Honor, this man denied Christ, his hands are unclean, any baptism he performed is contaminated, void. And then Augustine, leaning forward, his voice calmer. If that's true, then none of us are safe. For every minister is a sinner. The sacraments do not depend on the worthiness of the one who gives them, they depend on the grace of the one they point to. And Augustine's side won the case. The church declared the validity of a sacrament rests on God's promises, not the minister's performance. But like all great debates, it didn't stay settled. It would resurface whenever the church faced scandal. In the 9th century, scandal was brewing. Europe was fractured. The once mighty Carolingian Empire was collapsing. The papacy was in constant turnover. Popes rose and fell like the seasons. And into this chaos stepped Formosus. Before becoming pope, he was a talented diplomat. He brokered peace between warring kings. He could navigate politics with almost this supernatural skill. But diplomacy in that age was dangerous. And his decisions, while it made him allies, it also made him enemies. And his worst enemies accused him of breaking canon law, of seeking the papacy unlawfully, even of treason. And when they couldn't get him while he was alive, they waited. Formosus died in 896, and his immediate successor lasted only 15 days before dying himself. And then came Pope Stephen VI. Stephen had deep ties to Formosus's political rivals, and he was about to put on a spectacle Rome would never forget. So 7 months after Formosus's death, Stephen had his body dug up. Corpse was dressed in papal robes, a tiara placed on his head. set on a throne. A deacon was assigned to defend him, but Stephen himself shadowed the charges: perjury, violating church law, illegally seizing the papacy. And the trial lasted days. In the end, Formosus was declared guilty. His vestments were stripped away. The 3 fingers used to bless were cut off. His body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the river. And Stephen's goal, it wasn't just humiliation. This wasn't simply about dragging a rival's name through the mud. It was theological. Because in the 9th century, theology and politics weren't separate arenas. They were 2 sides of the same coin. And if Stephen could prove that Formosus had never been a true pope, then every single act of his papacy could be nullified. That meant every bishop that he had ordained would be considered illegitimate. And if those bishops were illegitimate, then every priest they had ordained were also invalid. And if those priests were invalid, then every baptism, every marriage, every Eucharist they had performed could be declared void. Now, think about that. In a time when sacraments were not just religious symbols, but the visible lifeline to salvation, this would have sent shockwaves across the Christian world. People would have woken up to find their marriage suddenly non-existent in the eyes of the church. Children thought to be baptized might need to be baptized again. Priests serving in towns and villages, they could be stripped of their roles overnight. This was the Donatist question, but it was back with a vengeance. Centuries earlier, Augustine had fought against this idea that the worthiness of the minister determined the validity of the sacrament. He had insisted that the sacrament's power came from God, not from the human who performed it. Stephen, in effect, was taking the Donatist side. He was using the old logic to weaponize theology against his enemies. It was a doctrinal argument being used as a political sledgehammer. And for Stephen, the beauty of it was he didn't just discredit his rival. It retroactively unraveled the entire legacy. But Stephen had miscalculated. What he thought was a brilliant maneuver, the Roman people saw as a grotesque sacrilege. The sight of a dead pope, dressed in sacred robes, propped up and mocked before a council. It crossed a line even in an age accustomed to public brutality. So whispers in the streets, they turned to shouting. Shouting soon turned to fury. Soon crowds surged against the papal palace. Stephen was dragged, stripped of his office, and thrown into prison. A few months later, his political allies gone and his enemies closing in, he was found dead, strangled in his cell. The new pope, Theodore II, annulled the Cadaver Synod. Formosus' body was recovered from the river and reburied with honor. More importantly, the church once again declared the validity of a sacrament does not depend on the moral character of the minister. Baptism by a corrupt priest was still baptism. Communion from a sinful bishop is still Christ's body and blood. And if you think that's just a medieval curiosity, think again, because this question still comes up. When a pastor today is caught in scandal, people ask, was my baptism real? Did my marriage vows count? Did I really know God? And the answer the church gave over 1,000 years ago still stands. Your faith, it rests on Christ, not the unbroken record of a human minister. And that's the good news of grace. The gospel doesn't collapse when a human messenger fails, because grace is not chained to the hands that give it. The Cadaver Synod still feels like a bad dream, but it left the church with something solid, a reminder that God's mercy will not rot in the ground. Hey, I'm Jordan. Thanks for listening to Theology Made.